Welcome back to Humanities 2. I'm Ivan Spencer, your professor for Humanities 2, and today we're going to be looking at Enlightenment political theory. Now you remember in the last lecture we looked at a lot of Enlightenment thinkers, Hume and Locke. Today we're going to look at some of the political thoughts that are emerging during this time as well. It's a fascinating period in a lot of ways because a lot of the political ideas that we take for granted today, that we simply assume are rooted in political theories at that time that were not assumed and had to be thought through and established. So let's take a look at some of the key themes here. First, we're going to look at Enlightenment theories of human nature. So in the last lecture we looked a lot at epistemology. How does one know what one knows and so forth, and the ramifications of that for metaphysics and so forth. But today we're going to look at some of the theories of human nature, what it is, what a human is. Next, more specifically on political theory, we're going to look at liberal political theory, the rise of political liberalism, not to be confused with liberal used in the term, in the comparison of liberal and conservative, okay, not in that sense, but liberal in the sense of liberal democracy. Next, we'll look at social contract theory and its relationship to this theory, or to liberal views. We'll be looking at the idea that all legitimate rule arises from consent. We'll also take a look at natural rights and natural law and see how the principle of consent is rooted in natural law. The concepts of equality and democracy, representative government, specific individual rights, personal autonomy and economic freedom, and the security of all of this ensured by the state. So hopefully these themes will resonate with you. You'll recognize them from our culture today. You may even find them have taken up deep resonance in your own beliefs. But now let's go back and look at some of these critical thinkers. Some of the key figures are going to be Jean-Jacques Rousseau. We'll look at his social contract. John Locke again. Some of the founding fathers, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and so forth. And so the key text that we're going to look at today will be John Locke's second treatise on government, written about published 1690. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, The Social Contract, published about 80 years later in 1762. And then the Federalist Papers, written by James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay, 1787, 1788. So these will be our key texts for today. Now, the time period we're looking at, again, is Enlightenment. But here we're looking about 1660 up to roughly the end of the Enlightenment, 1794, the end of the French Revolution or the Reign of Terror. 17th and 18th century political development parallels the ideas in epistemology, theology, and philosophy in the Enlightenment. In other words, it's part and parcel, so to speak, of Enlightenment political thought, or philosophical thought in epistemology, metaphysics, and theology, and so forth. So it rises out of that same kind of zeitgeist and climate, where we see reason begins to triumph over old political traditions and over the use of Scripture to validate monarchical rule. Sound and reasonable foundations that make sense to all will be appealed to, and that's going to be the basis of political thought. Locke's ideas were very commonsensical and could be understood by every man. Appeal to the masses for their consent is going to elevate the masses up to political dignity and dignify every man. And so this is a great democratizing, a leveling, if you will, social leveling ideology, political ideology. So first let's take a look at Locke's second treatise on government, written 1690. The second treatise builds on his first treatise, which is not often read. Very few people read the first treatise. The second treatise, though, is widely read. The first treatise refuted Sir Robert Filmer's theory of the divine right of kings. And this was a hot issue at this time in the 17th century, when the question was very much on everyone's mind: do kings have a divine right to rule, or should rule be based on something else? And so there was a lot of resistance to the king's rule, but Filmer held that this resistance to the king's rule was essentially rebellion toward God, because God had given the earth to Adam and to all of his direct descendants, his heirs. And so the kings, and on this theory, would have been the descendants of Adam, the heirs, and would have inherited rule of the earth, albeit over a small part of the earth, such as England. Refuting Filmer, using Scripture, Locke now sets out in the second treatise to explain what is the proper basis of power in government using reason. He's going to appeal mostly to reason and common sense in the second treatise. Now, he will occasionally appeal to Scripture, but it's only to bolster his case. In other words, he's not basing it on what Scripture teaches. He's simply using Scripture to say, see, even Scripture agrees with what I'm saying here. Okay. But the upshot of it is that God isn't the arbiter of specific rulers and powers. God doesn't select a specific king or ruler and so forth and so on and make them, give them power. So, for Locke, the nature of humanity is divinely created. Locke is a deist, and he does believe that God, or the Creator at least, has created mankind, or humanity, and imbued humanity with certain traits. And so this is going to be the basis of much of his thought. Now, that is not specifically a theist idea or a Christian idea. In other words, one can believe in a supreme being and that the supreme being made all, and the supreme being gives everything its traits, or the traits that they have, including human beings. So, human beings bear natural rights that Locke thinks are observable in nature, observable to any rational observer, and that these are rational ideas. Okay, so we're going to delve into that here in just a second. So, consent of freely associating rational beings will become the basis of power. That's the core idea here. Consent of freely associating rational beings is the proper basis of power. Now, let's just kind of go back in history just a little bit to see why Locke was writing this in 1690. A revolution had just taken place in England, known as the Glorious Revolution or the Bloodless Revolution of 1688. William of Orange took control of England. He had been ruler of the Netherlands. He took control of England and ended the Tudor line with James II, who abdicated the throne in 1688 and fled to France. James II was Roman Catholic, had ruled since 1685, or a very short period of time, and he wanted to rule without a parliament. He definitely believed in this idea of the divine right of kings, that he had an explicit, absolute right to power and didn't need to share it with anyone, such as a parliament or for that matter, anyone else. Now, he had inherited this view of politics from the other Tudors, going all the way back to James I. And so, James I being the first of the Tudor line. Now, under William of Orange, after James II had abdicated the government, under William of Orange, Parliament became the ruling body of England and became the embodiment of true power in legislation. The Whig theory of revolution and rule had been promoted by Locke and his circle of very influential friends. And so the Whig theory is basically that rule should come from the consent of the people, and that there is a time and a place that is proper for the people to rise up and throw off or revolt against oppressive government. We'll see that in Locke's second treatise, and we'll see how it's appealed to even by the founding fathers of America, Thomas Jefferson, in the Declaration of Independence. So proper rule is by consent. It is not in an absolute monarch. Locke's political ideas, not completely unique or original. Locke really doesn't present ideas that are original, but he is a master of pulling them together and stating them in such a way that everyone can understand them in a very commonsensical way. They were clearly laid out and explained after this revolution, the bloodless revolution, and in his two treatises of 1690. So now let's jump a little deeper into the second treatise. His treatise accomplishes several goals. It makes a rational, compelling case for rule by consent that corresponds with most people's experience. And so it just seems to have a lot of correspondence with what people experience in the world. There's a certain intuitiveness about what he says. After you read it, you're like, well, of course. Yes, that makes perfect sense. Now that you've spelled it out, yeah, who could not see that? And so his Whig views get a day in the full sun now after this glorious revolution, and now his second treatise is going to lay out that view. He effectively refutes all kinds of rival views. Filmer, yes, but he also is refuting Thomas Hobbes, a thinker that we haven't discussed too much. Hobbes had written a work called The Leviathan in 1651, and it came out just after another nasty war, a civil war in England. So the 17th century England is roiled and rocked by several civil wars, or several wars. Hobbes wanted to avoid such horrific wars. There are no wars as bad as a civil war. And it's always the worst kind of war. Hobbes advocated for a kind of social contract as well, but it's a social contract that consents to an absolute ruler. In other words, once the people consent to an absolute ruler, someone to rule over them, that ruler has absolute power. That ruler becomes a Leviathan, if you will, a kind of, it comes from the book of Job, where God is talking to Job and discusses with him the Leviathan, this mighty sea beast or sea creature, monster, if you will, that seems to be the most powerful creature in the world. And so Hobbes is using that as a kind of a metaphor for what the absolute ruler becomes, the most powerful ruler or being in a society that has absolute rule over everyone else. Yes, it's by consent, but once the monarch is elected or put into office, that's it. Absolute power resides in the monarch to bring peace and order to society, because the main problem, according to Hobbes, is that human beings are unruly, cantankerous, violent creatures, and they must be subdued. And so his view is that the absolute monarch, the Leviathan, has to rule over them with a despotic type of power. So it's kind of an alpha male approach to keeping the unruly and violent mobs under control. Locke is going to disdain this kind of rule. Locke is a much more sensible fellow. He doesn't think that, on Hobbes' view, that there's any accountability in the system. Once the absolute ruler has power, there's no accountability whatsoever. And for Locke, that's just not sensible. And Locke is, above all, a sensible man. Theories of government always emerge from theories of human nature. And this is something that we should grasp when we're looking at any political ideas. Political solutions rest upon an interpretation of human nature. Theories of what human nature are metaphysical, even materialistic views. So Locke is no different here, and it's not that difficult really to see what he's saying, because his view of human nature is going to be kind of that tabula rasa view that we saw in the earlier lectures about the human being. Yes, God, and a deistic conception of God, lies at the heart of his views, but humans are created with rational abilities, even though those rational abilities are somewhat of a blank slate. But he doesn't really think human beings are fallen, depraved, nasty, cruel creatures the way Hobbes does. Hobbes has a very pessimistic view of human nature. Locke's is neutral to positive in a sense. So there are two basic parts to Locke's theory in the second treatise. Two critical concepts that you must grasp. One is the state of nature and the other is the law of nature. Now, this state of nature thinking is going to run throughout all of the social contract theorists. Rousseau will use this concept. Hobbes used it to some extent. And so do the Founding Fathers. Madison will even mention it in the Federalist Papers, the state of nature in some places. Now, while Hobbes is extremely pessimistic about the state of nature, that is, that human beings in the state of nature are, yes, you're perfectly free, but they're violent. He famously says that life is nasty, brutish, and short in the state of nature. This would be a kind of state where no one has any government at all. Every human beings just kind of exist without government, and they interact with each other, but it quickly boils down to a kind of violent situation. And so fear is what's going to be what drives them out of that state into a kind of society, and they will select someone to rule over them. Now, on the other end of the scale, we see Rousseau, who will say that in the state of nature, human beings, yes, they're free, but they're also pretty good chaps. They're happy. We just take from nature what we need, and we take no more, and we don't hurt anyone. This is the noble savage view of human beings without society. And so you see, Rousseau's views rest on an interpretation of human nature, just as Hobbes does. And so Locke as well. Locke is kind of in the middle. He's more of a moderate on this. And so Locke does recognize that in the state of nature, human beings can get into a vicious cycle with each other and want to secure their property and secure their safety. And so they enter into a social contract. They come out of this societyless state of existence and experience and move into a society. Okay? So this is a theoretical construct also, by the way, in the sense that none of these guys ever point back to a time when everyone lived in a state of nature and there was no government. It's difficult to find that. Now, there are periods where government breaks down and anarchy is the way things are. Kind of human beings do go back to the state of nature, but they quickly come out. But this is a theoretical construct, and really what it does is enables the political thinker to construe human nature the way he or she thinks human nature is. Okay? Now, the law of nature, the second concept here, is that people are free, they're autonomous, and they're equal. In a state of nature where there is no government, there is no law enforcement because there are no laws and there are no policemen, there is no military, there's nothing. We just all live out in the wild in a kind of natural state. In that state, we would all be equals. We would all be perfectly free. And we would all be autonomous. I don't rely upon you, you don't rely upon me, and so forth and so on. And so we act to preserve our life. We act to preserve our freedom, and yes, we act to preserve our possessions as well. Okay? So in the law of nature, the idea here is that this is somehow kind of baked into what a human being is, and that is an entity that is free, is autonomous, and is equal, and that we act to preserve all of the results of that. Okay? So, he says, quote, "To understand political power, we must consider what state all men are naturally in, and that is a state of perfect freedom to order their actions and dispose of their possessions and persons as they see fit, within the bounds of the law of nature, without asking leave or depending upon the will of any other man." End quote. So, in the state of nature, everyone lives and interacts socially, yes, there's social interaction, but no government or political organization yet. So yes, I might see you, talk to you, but that doesn't mean we are politically organized, okay? People are equal by nature. There's no hierarchy. You're not above me, I'm not above you, and so with everyone else. There's no subjugation. We each live according to this law of nature. I understand that you have your possessions, you will protect them. You have your life and your family, and you will protect them, and so forth. And likewise, you understand that about me. And so we kind of stay off of each other's turf, if you will, okay? So people are amiable, according to Locke, in this type of scenario, unlike Hobbes, who would hold that this would quickly devolve into violence, okay? However, according to Locke, this isn't necessarily a state of anarchy and chaos. No one ought to harm another person in life, health, or liberty, or possessions, because all are created by God, he says, and everyone is given a kind of an equal status. Again, his deistic understanding emerges here. So the law of nature commands self-preservation. This is true. I have an intrinsic kind of baked-in, hardwired desire to preserve myself. And when self-preservation allows me to do so, to also preserve human life and prosperity for others, except obviously in cases of self-defense. Okay, so if you come and attack me, I have to defend myself or defend my property or my family. It seems like the golden rule almost put into a political, philosophical construct here. Okay, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. So each person must protect himself. I must redress grievances or offenses against me. There's no one I can go to, no law enforcement. I can't go file a complaint or anything like that. I can't call up anyone and say, hey, this person came over and stole my stuff or anything like that. And so if anyone is going to be punished for their offenses against me, I have to do it. I have to seek restitution. And so, unfortunately, what happens in such a case is a kind of a lex talionis. The law of retaliation begins to take over, and a vicious cycle of violence could prevail. This is a danger that drives rational people to establish a political society. So let's just imagine that we lived in a state of nature. You come over and you do some kind of violence to me or my family or my possessions, maybe when I'm not there, and I know that you did this. I go and do the same thing to you, and next thing you know, we're in a vicious cycle that escalates up into violence and death and bloodshed. And so rational people don't like this. We would like to escape this and just live in peace with each other. And so this is what drives us out of the state of nature, says Locke, into a political organization. We get together with some of our neighbors and we come up with an agreement. We consent. Because we're all equal, we all voluntarily enter into this agreement and we all consent to a rule. You can't come take my stuff, for example. Or you cannot come and harm one of my family members when I'm gone. Or you can't, there's certain things, we start coming up with specific rules. And then if you break that rule, then the group has agreed to come together to enforce the rule, to come up with a kind of punishment for one who would break the rule. And so the beginning of political society comes from rational people wanting to escape the kind of dangers that lurk in the state of nature. So, when or where has such a sequence of events ever occurred? Locke contends that in a way, even though he can't really point to any historical period, that in a way the kings of the world at that time in history, in the 17th century, the kings of the world existed in a state of nature. If I was the king of England, you're the king of France, and somebody else the king of Spain, and so forth and so on. Well, there's no law above us. We, as kings, live in a state of nature in a sense. Now, Kant will later on develop a system of global cooperation in his book, Perpetual Peace, which takes this whole social contract theory up to a global level. And it will what he's trying to do there is theorize of taking even kings and nations out of the state of nature with each other and bring them into a kind of social collaboration with each other, a type of international law or even an international ruling body such as the UN. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that later. So we see that the core idea of Locke's second treatise on government, rule must be by consent, and how people leave the state of nature engineers some social consent that has rules, that have teeth in it, that have enforcement, and then they enforce those rules against the people that break them. And so the social contract is rooted in human nature, he says. In this human nature, in his empirical epistemological viewpoint, is observable. It is something that is plainly seen by rational observers.